Because the reality is, what is this going to cost you? And they're not telling you the truth about costs. And this is where you're going to get hurt and small businesses are going to get hurt. Because when Ed Stelmach's wearing his good guy hat, he's telling you straight out, don't let anyone tell you that consumers aren't going to get dinged for this. Anyone who tells you different is full of bunk. I like to have fun with First Nations on this one because sometimes these politicians forget what they say. And not only a couple of months later, he was working on a different project wearing a different hat, and he's all of a sudden telling the public, don't worry, you're not going to get dinged for this. What I do say is this is going to triple your power costs or double your power costs, and I am saying that, and I intend to prove it to you. He says he doesn't know where I get these figures from. He says it's only going to cost you $8 a month. The industrial power consumers, these are big businesses, and they belong to an organization. They consume a lot of electricity. Over 50% of Alberta's electricity is consumed by these companies. They employ directly about 100,000 people. They have an organization to help them monitor electricity. They have engineers, and they even have a lawyer whose sole job is to watch the electricity market for them. These guys know it inside and out, and they're saying that they're worried about their costs possibly tripling or quadrupling, and our government is saying we know better than you. And it's really interesting because even the AESO said way back when, even the Bill 50 lines, not those export lines, but the Bill 50 lines, were going to cost about $8 billion. And then, of course, when you looked at the publications, it went up to $14.5 billion. But all you have to do is look at their actual projections, which are in the 10-year plan. And it's really easy to find. I took this right off the shortened version, page 12 to 14. And what they're saying is it's going to cost $16.6 billion to upgrade the system. Now, one of the things that is accurate in there is they show you the breakdown. Industry pays the most, commercial business pays the second most, and farmers pay the least. Government is proposing to invest $16.6 billion into the transmission system. This is a bill I took from a single lady east of Camrose. That bill is roughly $80 a month. That's what her bill averages. There's her transmission charge, $10. What's that transmission charge based on? A system with a net asset value of $2 billion. How do you invest $16.6 billion and not have that go up 8 times? That's my question I asked the AESO. That's the question I asked the government, and that's the question nobody will answer. If that charge goes up 8 times, that bill just doubled. This is a commercial business. The average bill this person pays is $70 a month. Only pays for lights, but look at his transmission charge. He's commercial. $25 a month, not 10. Pays more, right? What happens if that charge went up 8 times? His bill nearly tripled. Didn't quite triple, but nearly tripled. I like to throw in an agricultural one. This is a dairy farm just north of me. Basically, roughly $800 a month. That's their transmission charge. Their bill would double. So when I'm out here telling people, if we do all this, if we invest $16.6 billion, there is a risk that your bill will double, and there is a risk that small businesses in your community will see their bills triple. How many of your local small businesses can handle that kind of charge? And there's a whole lot that can't. Now, the problem I'm having with our own AESO and with our industry, even without building this, the REA in my area got a letter and their transmission charge went up over 100%, and nobody can explain to them why. So without any of that $16.6 billion even injected into this, people are seeing their transmission charges go up. Alberta Newsprint tabled a letter at the legislature, so I like to use them as an example because you can go check me and go get a copy of this letter. They pay $12.5 million a year in transmission charges. And they're telling the government, if that doubles, we're done. And I'm thinking, doubling? They're talking about that going up 8 times. That's staggering to me. So let's say it's all true. Let's say it's not going up 8 times, it's just going to go up quite a bit. What Alberta Newsprint is saying that we can't handle it doubling. So what's Alberta Newsprint doing? I haven't even been up there, I haven't talked to them. I already know what they're doing. They're looking to get off the grid. They're looking to co-generate. What happens if they get off the grid? They don't have to pay that $12.5 million a year. That's right, we do. It gets passed down to us. It gets passed down to somebody. And that's the real danger for our economy. If these big industries, these big consumers are able to get off the grid, that cost is passed on to everyone else. At what point do some businesses like metal fabricators move? Because I'm going to tell you right now, the biggest employer, the biggest economic engine in this province is the biggest economic engine in Canada. Oh, by the way, it's the biggest economic engine in North America, we call it the oil sands. And I'm here to tell you right now, they do not care if they go all the way to Taiwan for steel or anywhere else for their products. They're going to be competitive. So if a metal fabricator in Saskatoon is competing against a metal fabricator in Edmonton, but the guy in Edmonton is paying 3 times the electricity cost, who's more competitive? You're going to see people start looking to go to other jurisdictions. Now, I talked about that Heartland line because this is where the bad news comes in. That $16.6 billion, the Heartland line was estimated to be $240 million originally. That was the original estimate. And one thing that AESO has been consistent at, underestimating by well over 100% on a regular basis. So the day they tabled that line, it doubled in price to $580 million. And some of you in here just recently told me about another line they were talking about that it escalated way out of sight. I think it was down around Pincher Creek. Every line that I have seen the AESO recommend, by the time they tabled it, it had doubled in price. And I'm here to tell you, as somebody who has designed transmission, particularly in the phone company, when it actually gets built, usually you see a rise again in actual construction costs by the time you actually get out there with shovels in the ground. What that would mean is if everything held true and AESO remained consistent the way they've been, that $16.6 billion would then increase well, NMAX said well over $22 billion. I say it's going to push closer to 32. Yikes is right. You can't afford that. This province can't afford that. And the industrial power consumers are telling everybody, we can't afford that. It's going to force our industries to relocate. And that's what they wrote the MLAs. They wrote the entire PC caucus. They said, if you build this, it's going to make us uncompetitive. And it says we're going to unnecessarily mortgage Albertans' future. Those are the major industries. That's not Joe Anglin saying that. And our MLAs are telling them, we know better than you. I'm here to tell you, I'm stunned at that comment. We know better than you. It's embarrassing. These are the people who know what they're doing. They know how to build products. They know how to produce paper. They know how to make cement. Cement, by the way, has, I think their electricity overhead represents around 80 to 90% of their input costs. Staggering. So there were some studies done. The University of Calgary did a study just on the HVDC lines, and they published their study, and they said that it's inefficient and unwarranted. They really challenged AESO's logic in coming up with the reasons why we need these lines. And the government didn't like that, so the government got the Utility Consumer Advocate to do a study. And the Consumer Advocate went to EDC Associates and said, would you do a study on these 2 big lines for us so we can see, what the economics are? And they did. And they published their study. And what EDC Associates told them was, AESO's being misleading and biased. This is uneconomical. And the Utility Consumer Advocate should advocate against it. And I'm here to tell you that the Utility Consumer Advocate hid that report, never released it until it got leaked. It had to get leaked before we found that report. No one else has done any other report. I want to make this clear. I'm not against transmission lines. I'm not. I've climbed these towers. I was a lineman before I was an engineer. I've climbed lots of poles, too many to count. I like electricity. I like my little slideshow. I'm here to tell you the lights are on, and I want to keep the lights on. Our economy runs on electricity. What I'm against is unreasonable expenditures of a government that doesn't know what it's doing. That's what I'm against. I'm not even against export. I think we need to be interconnected with our other jurisdictions. And we will import and export power on a regular basis. We do on an hourly basis, for crying out loud. What I don't understand is why we can't admit this is for export and then deal with the issue. I think I know the reason why, but I get frustrated. Diana McQueen is now a Minister of Cabinet, but here's those softball questions they like to throw just for show up at the ledge. Is this about export? And old Mel Knight stands up. Absolutely not. This is not about export. It's on the record. And they like to argue. They say, you know what? We have to import power on a regular basis. I chuckle on this one. It makes it seem like we don't have enough power in this province. And even Ed likes that argument. In his letter that he wrote to his constituents, he says, we import power on a regular basis. What they don't tell you is, when the prices are high here, import is really, really cheap. Remember that slide I showed you before? We refer to it as undesirable effect on the market. See, we have a direct line going from Langdon to Cranbrook, BC that connects to BC Hydro. And what's on the other side of Langdon? Calgary, major urban area. has direct access to cheap hydropower. And they will get fined, and they have been fined, for buying cheap hydropower from BC when more expensive coal power was available from Wabamun. How's that for a competitive market? But I want to talk about export, and in AESO's own documentation, they list the two north-south lines between Edmonton and Calgary as the export timeline. But they're clear to say that this isn't about export. If you go to the 10-year plan, it lists it in the 10-year plan, under critical, by the way, is the transmission line going to the Pacific Northwest. If you go down to the Pacific Northwest, and they got 20 projects that they consider critical to their economic needs, the top 2 come from Canada. One comes from BC, and the other comes from Alberta. And I chuckle at this one. The line that they're considering critical is called the Edmonton Heartland line, and it's critical for export to electricity to the United States. That's what they're saying down in the United States, but up here our government's saying it's not for export. And you don't have to look far. It's right on the Western Electric Coordinated Council website. There's the map. Comes from Edmonton, goes all the way down to Southern California. And yet they deny that. And it's funny because when I've tracked the industry down, the Edmonton Journal reported that TransAlta said, you know, and this is their CEO, Steve Snyder, he says, these export opportunities spark us to build more generators and transmission lines than we need. But he forgets, you're paying for the transmission line, not him. So what he's saying is forcing you to pay for more transmission lines than you need. That's what he's saying. But TransCanada, Hal Kiesel, these people don't pay attention to what they're saying when I'm listening. He's saying if we build more generators in Alberta, which we are every time we grow economically, and we don't connect up to the United States to sell all this electricity, you're going to have cheap electricity prices. That's what he's saying. So I'm going to change that. I'm going to paraphrase that. I need you to spend billions of dollars so you can have higher prices. That's what he's saying. But all the evidence about export is in a report that our own AESO helped co-author. It's called the CNC report. And it's an amazing document. It's all about how to get power from northern Alberta, northern Canada, to Southern California. The red lines represent AC power, and the blue lines represent DC. And this report is all the various options our AESO came up with on how to get power down to Southern California. Now, I like this one because I was up in Peace River when they were dealing with a possible nuclear power plant. And Frank Oberle, who happens to be the cabinet minister, stated in front of a crowd of about 200 people, there'll be no transmission line hooked up to a nuclear power plant. Think about that for a second. He's a member of cabinet that voted on this stuff, and he actually said that to a crowd. So I brought up this slide and I put it on the wall, and I asked somebody, I said, do you know where this Wesley is? It's a dot way up at the top part of your screen. And some lady jumped up, she said, that's right outside my back door. I said, well, follow that red line all the way down to where it connects with the blue line. Tell me where it ends. It ends all the way down in Southern California. And this report goes on and on and on. I throw this in for the Pincher Creek people. It's a very detailed report with all the different options, and it goes to great length to describe how we're going to get all this electricity from Alberta down to the United States. I stole this slide from the National Energy Board because Sheila Leggett went down to the States and made a presentation, and she said, guess what, gentlemen? This is what Canada is going to do for you. This was to the Governors Association down there. And look at all those arrows coming out of Alberta. Yet I have a government, you have a government here that says this is not about export. On May 5th, 2010, after Bill 50 was passed, TransAlta applied for approval to export 17,520,000 megawatt hours a year for the next 10 years. And they received approval in July of 2010 to export 17,500,000 megawatt hours a year. How does that compare? Well, if you actually do the math, it averages out to about 48,000 megawatt hours a day. What's our demand and what's our all-time high? Yet you have a government out here saying that we need more electricity, and the data just doesn't support that. So for the next 10 years, TransAlta has the authority and the right to export almost 5 times our peak demand every day. Now, they're not doing it because we haven't built the export lines yet. But they got approval in advance waiting for all that to happen.